Welcome back to Newsday. We'll go straight to our poly panel. We're joined by Liberal MP Tim Wilson and Labor MP Anna Ali. Thank you for your time. Let's start with the biggest story of the day. We've got Yang Hengjun arrested in China, potentially about to be charged with espionage. Anna Ali, I'll start with you first. What do you make of the government's response in this case? Could they be stronger? And in particular, I'd love your response to Michael McCormack's comments yesterday, reverting back to our trade relationship.
Look, I think the government has, and Labor supports the government in their response in expressing very, very strong concerns about Dr. Yang's well-being and about his safety and security in China. The rising soft influence of China in the region means that we do have to reassess our relationship with China. And most Western nations have to also assess their relationship with China and look at not just our trade relationship, but our diplomatic relationship with them as well.
Tim, what are your thoughts? We've been warned by China not to try to intervene. Is this the government's job, though? You've got an Australian citizen potentially facing the death penalty.
Well, the Foreign Minister has been extremely clear that we're very concerned about the circumstance of letting him to be detained for such a long period of time. We're waiting, of course, to see charges laid, but we've also been categorical in saying that if he's being held for his political beliefs, then that is not a justification. And then in addition to that, he should be treated with due process and humanely as part of the circumstances of his detention. And so that's what the Foreign Minister has been very clear about. I certainly back her up very strongly, and I'm glad to see such strength in the comments from the Foreign Minister on this matter.
And Ali, just to get you on that point of Michael McCormack's comments, as the acting Prime Minister, it was quite extraordinary to see him sidestep the issue, say he hadn't been briefed, and return to the trade relationship with China. Was that appropriate in the context?
No, I don't think it is. It is appropriate, particularly as acting Prime Minister. In any case, he should be on top of every point of our relationship with China, given that it's one of the most significant international relations issues at the moment, and particularly for Australia and for our region. And this issue with Dr. Yang at the moment being arrested in China with this prospect of him being charged with espionage, I think really forces us to look at what is our relationship with China, moving beyond our trade relationship and looking at China's growing soft influence. For many years now, political analysts have been saying and have been lamenting in many regards the kind of squandering of Western nations' soft power, where China has stepped in to avoid of Western nations retreating on their soft power with nations that we should be seeking to attract and influence. I think we really need to look at, moving forward, how do we engage with China, how do we engage with our region, taking into account this soft power and the soft power tools that we have at our disposal.
Tim Wilson, Anna Ali raises some good points, and we see this as a flashpoint in so many university campuses around Australia. Do you think universities have been too happy to take the money for students and not work on protecting what could be foreign interference on campuses?
Well, I think a lot of Australian universities have frankly been naive in the approach that's being taken through the soft influence and power that's been exercised by China through things like Confucius Institutes. Obviously, we're now having a discussion about the volume of Chinese students in Australian universities and making sure we're not overly dependent. But I think we are all having that reflection and that conversation, and this has not fallen on deaf ears. Some of us are very well aware of it and have stood up on a number of occasions about concerns about Australia making decisions in our national interest. I was one of the people who stood up and spoke out against the China extradition treaty within government that ultimately saw it being shelved. And this is going to be not just a conversation for today, it's not just a conversation we've had in recent years, it's a conversation we're going to continue to have into the future. And of course, a lot of these issues are being brought out today in ICAC and in the past couple of days in ICAC in New South Wales, where we're seeing China's businessmen donating huge sums of money, and there are questions around the legality of them doing so to the New South Wales Labor Party. And so we have to be mindful, aware, prepared and take action at every point to defend Australia's national interest, and that's what this government is doing.
There is some really extraordinary allegations coming out of ICAC. I understand that Kayla Murnane has denied that she ever saw that bag of cash, $100,000 in cash in an Aldi bag. Anna-Leigh, these allegations must have you very concerned as a Labor MP. What do you make of what's coming out of ICAC at the moment, and what should the Labor Party do in response?
Well, I'm not going to make any running commentary on an investigation that's ongoing, particularly an ICAC investigation. But I will say that any kind of suggestions or allegations of foreign interference in our democratic process are worrying and very concerning. We now have passed in the Parliament with both Labor support and by the Coalition a robust legislative framework against foreign interference in our democratic process. Labor 2 years ago, introduced a voluntary ban on foreign donations. So we're cognizant of this issue. I can't comment on what goes on with New South Wales Labor, and I can't comment on an ongoing investigation either.
No, but it certainly is worrying that especially donations of those size are coming through allegedly in bags, in shopping bags. Is there something, Tim Wilson, you think that should be done to investigate this particular issue further?
Well, I think it is already being investigated, so I'm reticent to say that there should be further steps. I think people can now see what's on the public record. There'll be further investigations as part of the ICAC process. I don't think it's appropriate for me to delve into the detail of that, least because we're not fully across all aspects of it. But I think most people would be shocked and alarmed. But it's not as though it's the first time that there's been big questions asked about the New South Wales division of the Labor Party. And I've got to say, even this one has shocked, I think, myself and a lot of other, well, has definitely shocked me, and I think a lot of other people with just what is being alleged here and the conduct that is being alleged by some senior figures within the ALP, particularly after the events with Sam Dastyari only a couple of years ago.
And we will be checking in with the latest from the ICAC hearings soon. But if we can change pace a little bit, the Nine papers are reporting a story about politicians increasingly concerned about their personal safety and asking more of national security agencies to keep them protected. Anna-Leigh, what are your thoughts on this? Have you personally felt this has been an issue? Have you seen this firsthand?
Oh, it was just a few weeks ago that I had somebody come into my office with a knife, wielding a knife. And, you know, we're very fortunate as politicians. We need to recognise that we have access to security and security systems. So when somebody walked into my office with a knife, my office undertook a protocol whereby we pressed the alarm buttons, we called police. I undertook with one of my other staff members to keep him calm and keep him talking and keep him contained within the office, fully aware that if he left the office, he would be armed and into a shopping centre where people didn't have the same level of personal security that I have. But I think there is a worrying trend that we're seeing here with more and more politicians and parliamentarians experiencing threats that are moving from the online space, whereas traditionally you might get somebody say something threatening or offensive on your Facebook posts, to the offline space.
Tim Wilson, do you agree? Do you think this is online unpleasantness spilling out into the real world?
I don't think it's necessarily just online unpleasantness making its way into the real world. I'm not disputing that that's part of it as well. I think there's a general concern around one of the great strengths, frankly, of Australian democracy is that politicians can walk around the street, there's no security arrangements around them, and I think a lot of us are experiencing that increasingly as a question mark attached about whether that continues to be viable. I mean, some people have raised concerns at community events and where they feel like they're sitting ducks. And I certainly know even only in the past couple of weeks, I've had incidents in the Goldstein electorate office where people have come in and engaged in physical acts of violence against property, not against people, although that's only because they haven't been able to access people. And I'm quite sure that other people have very similar experiences. And I guess the challenge for all of us is the extent to which we feel comfortable in our job. And I guess when you're in Parliament House, you know, there's an enormous amount of security, but I think we're all pretty mindful of it these days.
I know that was the conversation during the election campaign when Scott Morrison had that egg thrown at him. The concern was that we'd end up like US presidential style with no one allowed anywhere near their representatives. But do you think more could be done, Anna-Lee, to protect politicians?
I think we already have an extraordinary level of personal protection that the average Australian doesn't have. And, you know, you might argue that that's necessary because of the high-profile public, especially if you're tend to be a controversial politician. You know, I think there's also a level of personal responsibility that we have. Personally, I don't feel threatened, or I don't feel any harm to my safety in dealing with my constituency or being out in my community. Not at all. And even with the event that happened several weeks ago with somebody coming into my office wielding a knife, I wasn't so much concerned for my safety because we have that level of security in my office. My concern is more for the safety of the public if somebody wielding a knife was allowed out of my office and into a public space. So I think there's a level of personal responsibility, but also it's up to everyone to assess their personal safety as well and to take those precautions, whether they're protection or avoidance behaviours, as they see fit.
Tim Wilson, do you agree?
A fundamental principle, of course I do. The only thing I'd be concerned, follow up in Anne's comments, is while there have been attacks or acts of physical violence in the Goldstein office, as a general rule, the vast majority of the public are entirely law-abiding, but you always get the few people. I'm concerned about the impact also, I agree, on the public, but also on staff members who often are there to help and assist and sometimes can get caught up in people's disputes or arguments, and in those circumstances, they're often there, frankly, trying to address these situations when we're not present. But people assume that we're going to be in our offices when we're often in Canberra, out in the community doing various things. So it is important that we take responsibility. It's important that we're mindful, but when situations escalate, the AFP and others have the powers and the responsibility to assist in that process as well.
Absolutely. There's certainly no easy answer, but we will have to wrap it up there. Anna-Lee, Labor MP from WA, and Tim Wilson, Liberal from Victoria, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Anna-Lee.